John Sedgwick. On the morning of May 9, 1864, 50-year-old John Sedgwick walked along the Union front line at Spotsylvania Courthouse in Virginia. Sedgwick commanded the 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac and was one of the most popular generals in the Union Army. His men called him Uncle John. He was directing the placement of artillery when Confederate sharpshooters began firing from a tree line roughly 1,000 yards away. The infantry around him flinched and ducked at every distant crack. Sedgwick walked among them, visibly amused. He told them they were embarrassing themselves. At this distance, the Confederates couldn't hit an elephant. A few seconds later, a bullet struck him directly below the left eye. Sedgwick fell forward into the arms of an aide. He never spoke. The round had been fired from a Whitworth rifle, an English-made precision weapon used by elite Confederate sharpshooters with effective range well beyond standard rifles of the period. The men who had been ducking moments earlier stood in silence around the body. Sedgwick died within minutes. He was the highest-ranking Union officer killed in the entire war. Grant, on hearing the news, asked twice whether Sedgwick was really dead, then said his loss was worse than the loss of a division. Albert Sidney Johnston. On April 6, 1862, 59-year-old Albert Sidney Johnston led the Confederate assault at the Battle of Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had called Johnston the finest general in America and staked the war effort in the Western Theater on him. Johnston commanded over 40,000 men that morning in a surprise attack on Ulysses S. Grant's army, camped near Pittsburgh Landing. Rather than command from the rear, Johnston rode through the front lines, rallying his troops in person. By early afternoon, the Confederate advance had pushed Union forces back nearly 2 miles. Around 2 p.m., Johnston was directing an assault near a peach orchard when a bullet struck him behind his right knee. The round severed his popliteal artery. Johnston kept riding. He continued issuing orders, apparently unaware of the severity of the wound. His boot filled with blood. Witnesses later described him swaying in the saddle and pale-faced before he was caught by his staff and lowered to the ground in a small ravine. He was carrying a tourniquet in his pocket. He had used the same device to save other men's lives. His personal physician was not with him. Johnston had ordered the doctor away earlier that day to treat wounded Union prisoners. By the time staff officers realized how serious the bleeding was, no medical help was nearby. Albert Sidney Johnston bled to death in the ravine within minutes, the unused tourniquet still on him. The Confederacy lost both Shiloh and the man Davis had called irreplaceable, Stonewall Jackson. On the night of May 2, 1863, 39-year-old Thomas Stonewall Jackson rode through dense woods near the Chancellorsville Crossroads in Virginia. Jackson had spent 2 years building a reputation as the Confederacy's most aggressive corps commander. His flanking march that day had crushed the Union 11th Corps in one of the most successful maneuvers of the war. Robert E. Lee considered him irreplaceable. Around 9 p.m., Jackson rode ahead of his own lines with a small staff to scout Union positions in the darkness. The forest was thick. Visibility was almost zero as Jackson's group returned through the trees. Soldiers of the 18th North Carolina Infantry heard hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the enemy. They opened fire at close range. 3 bullets struck Jackson. One round shattered his left arm below the shoulder. A second passed through his right hand. A third lodged in his left forearm. His horse bolted into low branches that struck him in the face. Staff officers pulled him down and carried him from the field on a stretcher, dropping him once when one of the bearers was shot. Surgeons amputated his left arm at a field hospital around 2 a.m. on May 3rd. He was moved to a plantation called Fairfield to recover. The bullets hadn't killed him. What came next did. 8 days after the shooting, pneumonia set in. Stonewall Jackson died on May 10, 1863. Lee's response on hearing the news became famous. "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." James McPherson. On July 22, 1864, 35-year-old James McPherson rode toward the front line during the Battle of Atlanta. McPherson commanded the Army of the Tennessee and was the youngest of Sherman's 3 Army commanders. Grant had privately marked him as a future general-in-chief of the entire Union Army. He was engaged to be married to a woman named Emily Hoffman in Baltimore. Around midday, Confederate General John Bell Hood launched a surprise attack on the Union left flank. McPherson rode south from Sherman's headquarters with a small staff to assess the situation. He left most of his escort behind. Riding through dense woods near a road called Sugar Creek, McPherson came around a bend and rode directly into a skirmish line of Confederate infantry from Patrick Cleburne's division. The soldiers ordered him to halt. McPherson reined in, raised his hat in a brief salute, and turned his horse to ride back the way he had come. A Confederate soldier fired a single round into his back. The bullet passed through his right lung and exited near his heart. McPherson fell from the saddle. He was carried to a nearby house but died within the hour from internal bleeding. Sherman, on receiving the body, broke down in tears in front of his staff. Behavior no one who served under him recorded before or after. McPherson became the second highest-ranking Union officer killed in the war. Emily Hoffman wore black mourning for the rest of her life and never married. Leonidas Polk. On the morning of June 14, 1864, 57-year-old Leonidas Polk climbed Pine Mountain in Bartow County, Georgia, to observe Union positions during the Atlanta campaign. Before the war, Polk had been the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana. He had resigned his church post in 1861 to accept a Confederate commission, and his men called him the Fighting Bishop. He commanded a corps under Joseph E. Johnston. Polk reached the summit of Pine Mountain with Generals Johnston and William Hardee around 10:30 a.m. The three officers stood together on an exposed rock outcrop, examining the Union lines below through field glasses. Roughly a mile away, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman spotted the cluster of officers through his own glass. He ordered a nearby battery of Parrott rifles to fire on the position. The first shell landed close. Hardee and Johnston stepped behind cover. Polk did not move quickly enough. The second shell struck him in the left arm, passed through his chest, and exited the right side of his body before exploding against a tree behind him. Hardee and Johnston, standing within a few feet of him, were unhurt. Polk was killed instantly. There was no medical response, no last words, no extended dying. Staff officers wrapped the body in an oilcloth and carried it down the mountain. A blood-stained New Testament was found in his uniform pocket. The Atlanta campaign continued the next day, but Sherman is reported to have remarked simply that the fighting bishop had been removed from the board. J.E.B. Stuart. On May 11, 1864, 31-year-old J.E.B. Stuart fought at Yellow Tavern, 6 miles north of Richmond, Virginia. Stuart was the Confederacy's senior cavalry commander and Robert E. Lee's primary source of intelligence on Union movements. Union General Philip Sheridan had launched a 10,000-strong cavalry raid toward Richmond. Stuart, with roughly 4,500 men, moved to block him. The fight at Yellow Tavern lasted most of the day. By late afternoon, Union cavalry under Brigadier General George Custer broke through Stuart's left flank. Stuart rode forward to rally his troopers as Custer's men pulled back through the Confederate line on foot. One of those dismounted Union cavalrymen was John A. Huff, a 48-year-old private from the 5th Michigan Cavalry. Huff had been a champion marksman before the war. As he passed within 10 to 15 yards of Stuart, he raised his .44 caliber pistol and fired a single shot. The bullet entered Stuart's left side just below the ribs and lodged in his abdomen. Stuart slumped in the saddle, but stayed mounted long enough to call out an order to his men not to retreat. Staff officers pulled him from his horse and loaded him into an ambulance. Stuart was taken to his brother-in-law's house in Richmond. He died there the following day, May 12, 1864, from internal bleeding. With him went the Army of Northern Virginia's eyes. Lee never again had a cavalry commander he fully trusted, and the gap shaped every campaign that followed. Patrick Cleburne. On the afternoon of November 30, 1864, 36-year-old Patrick Cleburne prepared his division for a frontal assault at the Battle of Franklin in central Tennessee. Cleburne had been born in County Cork, Ireland, and emigrated to Arkansas as a young man. By 1864, he was widely considered the best division commander in the Army of Tennessee. Union troops who had fought him called him the Stonewall of the West. The Confederate plan that day required an open assault across 2 miles of unbroken farmland directly into entrenched Union positions outside Franklin. There was no flanking option, no artillery preparation worth the name, and no realistic prospect of success. Cleburne reportedly told a fellow officer that if the assault succeeded, he would owe the credit to others, and if it failed, he would not survive. The attack stepped off around 4 p.m., with roughly 20,000 Confederate troops in the line. Cleburne advanced on horseback at the head of his division. His first horse was shot from under him. He mounted a second. That horse was killed within minutes. Cleburne continued on foot toward the Union earthworks. He was struck by a single bullet just below the heart, roughly 50 yards from the Union line. He died instantly. 6 Confederate generals were killed or mortally wounded at Franklin in under 5 hours. Cleburne's body was recovered the next morning, his sword and pocket watch already taken by Union soldiers. The Army of Tennessee never recovered as a fighting force.